On this episode of The Prior Transformation, I interviewed Kaj Larsen, who was a U.S. Navy SEAL. Kaj also was a reporter for Vice. So if you've ever seen any of those HBO or YouTube specials where there was a guy who they would send into conflict areas, you probably are familiar with Kaj's work because he was that guy effectively. He would go into some of these let's just call them what they are, effectively war zones, and he would do really, really great reporting work. So we chat a little bit about that. We also talk a little bit about his involvement with CrossFit Santa Monica, which is a gym here for those folks in LA that you should definitely check out. He owns that gym along with a couple of his colleagues from the SEAL days. So we talk a bit about that stuff. We also talk a lot about the SEAL training, which is a really great treat for me because I have been fascinated for years about U.S. Navy SEALs, specifically how their training operates and how they're able to take folks and teach them how to work, effectively in a unit as a team. And also how they are able to teach people how to lead the teams effectively and push themselves and their colleagues beyond what limits that people thought existed, prior to the training. So we talk quite a bit about that stuff, which is great. And this is one of my favorite episodes. So hope you guys like this one. Let's get started. Welcome to the Prior Transformation Podcast. I'm your host, Jimmy Smoots. In this podcast, we explore, there's no we, it's just I'm the only person here. And really, I just ramble for 2 or 3 minutes on a technology or business topic. And occasionally, I'll interview some smart folks. If you like that kind of thing, enjoy. Welcome back. I'm here with Kaj Larsen. Kaj, thanks for joining us today.
Awesome to be here. Thanks for having me.
Yeah. So I'd love to kind of just start off and hear, what you're up to. You got a lot of stuff that you've done. I'd love to hear about what you're doing now and kind of your story, how you got to where you are.
Yeah, well, that's a big question, but I'll try and distill it down really simply. I started off, I'm a surfer kid from Santa Cruz, which is a sleepy little town in Northern California. And we were actually, before the show started, we were talking about flying. My dad got me flying lessons when I was really young in Cessna 152s out of Watsonville Airport. And I couldn't even see over the hood. So I had to sit on telephone books. And
that's great.
Although for your younger listeners, these are these things that were like these thick books that came in the mail and they had everybody's phone number in them. I know it sounds bizarre now, but so I got started kind of with a love for aviation, and I always thought I was going to fly. That took me, along with a water polo scholarship, to the U.S. Naval Academy in Annapolis, Maryland. So that's where I went for the beginning of my undergraduate career. And then I spent 2 years there at the Naval Academy, transferred out, graduated from University of California. Originally, I wanted to fly. That's why I went to the academy, a lot of Top Gun, thought I was going to be a fighter pilot. Then when I was at the Naval Academy, I found this other community that fit my personality pretty well. This is, back in 95. I'd never even heard of the SEAL teams. Everybody was watching Chuck Norris movies, Delta Force. And everybody's talking about Delta, right?
Yeah.
Oh my, how times have changed, right?
Yeah.
So after I graduated from undergraduate, I applied to officer candidate school for a SEAL billet. They give about 10 billets for SEAL officers every year to enter the training pipeline. I applied and got one. And in, I think it was May of 2001. Yeah, May of 2001. After I had graduated number 1 in my class from officer candidate school, I reported to basic underwater demolition SEAL training. I classed up in September, late August, early September of that year with SEAL training class 237. And then 9/11 hit. So I was very firmly a wartime SEAL. Finished my training pipeline about 11 months later, reported to my first SEAL team, SEAL Team 1, served 5 years on active duty as a U.S. Navy SEAL, then went on later on to serve 7 years as a reservist. And then went to graduate school once I got off active duty and was still serving as a reservist. After graduate school, I became a journalist. I like to joke that I traded my gun for a camera. And I started covering some of the same war zones and conflict zones I had been in uniform. And that kind of brought me to my current occupation. I've been a journalist. I've been working in media and entertainment for the last decade. I also am an entrepreneur and a former frogman, still trying to give back to the community.
It's actually, I had this as a note here. You're involved in CrossFit Santa Monica, right?
I own CrossFit Santa Monica.
I think we met when you guys were just like opening it. I think I came by with my wife. I don't know, it was like you guys were just putting stuff in. We were like putting the things in. I came by and I was like, I used to train at CrossFit LA back when I was in shape.
With Petronic.
Yes. Yeah. With Andy.
Yeah.
And actually, by the way, I trained with Andy when it was Petronic Fitness. It was like a garage.
Yeah.
It wasn't CrossFit LA.
Andy's awesome. He was the OG CrossFitter.
Yeah.
Yeah.
In LA.
Also a veteran himself.
Yeah.
Former Marine.
Right? Yep. Anyway, I was trying to put it together, and then I think I saw your picture on the CrossFit website, and I was like, oh my God, I think we did connect there. So that's cool.
That's super cool. I actually own CrossFit Santa Monica with my best friend. He's another SEAL. We were in the SEAL teams together. We were roommates at Harvard together. Now we own CrossFit Santa Monica. It
actually makes sense that the logo is the trident now.
Exactly.
Right? Okay, that makes sense now. Okay.
Yeah, exactly. And funny enough, CFSM CrossFit Santa Monica has been like an awesome learning lesson just in kind of boots on the ground, bootstrapping entrepreneurialism. There's no glamour in scrubbing the floors the night before it's open, right? But that's what's required in any kind of startup environment. So it's been great in that capacity, and it's also been great to watch it grow in a community. But CrossFit actually started in my hometown of Santa Cruz. So it's also been amazing to watch, out of this small little counterculture town, this CrossFit enterprise expand to 11,000 gyms domestically and 16,000 internationally. It's been cool to watch it take off.
Yeah, man, it's huge.
Huge, right?
It was crazy. When I was training with Andy, it was like this kind of niche thing and nobody really knew about it. And now it's just everybody does. It's insane how big it is, It's really cool to see that success.
Yeah,
it's
yeah.
Cool.
We got to get you in the gym.
Yeah, no, I really do.
For beach workout.
I do need to do something, man. It's bad. I've been riding the bike, so
nice.
Let's start there and kind of back into it slowly. I always joke with people that I suffer from an injury called laziness, which I picked up years ago. So.
Oh, yeah.
Anyway, yeah, so you mentioned a lot of stuff in your
Me too.
Your story.
I got that injury too.
You mentioned a lot of stuff. The SEAL billet was really interesting. I pronounced that right, billet, right? So you applied to be a SEAL almost from the beginning before OCS. Is that kind of how it worked?
Yeah. So there.
And by the way, what's OCS? Just to explain to people.
Yeah. Sorry, and I usually
try
try and refrain from doing too many acronyms. OCS is Officer Candidate School. Probably most made famous in cinema by that movie, An Officer and a Gentleman, starring Richard Gere. Another sort of dated reference, but my dad made me watch it as a kid. Awesome movie. Watched it the other day. Still holds.
That's good.
Yeah. And drives his Triumph motorcycle around. So that's Officer Candidate School. There's multiple pipelines to becoming a U.S. Navy SEAL, and this is kind of a little granular but slightly misunderstood. There's basically, you have to be in the Navy first. And there's two paths. You can either go from the enlisted community or from the officer community. And those two approaches are kind of different. Most SEALs are enlisted guys. The ratio is about 3-to-1. So for every one SEAL officer, there's 3 to 4 enlisted SEALs. So the officer cadre is kind of the leadership cadre. And the distinction there is that you have a college degree and you go through an officer pipeline. Now, there's actually plenty of enlisted SEALs who have college degrees, but they didn't go through one of the officer training programs. There's 3 ways to get commissioned as an officer in the U.S. military. The first is Officer Candidate School. That means you have your college degree, they send you to Pensacola, Florida in my time, and you go through like kind of, they call them 14-week wonders, a boot camp indoctrination kind of process. The second commissioning pipeline is one of the service academies. So in the case of the Navy, the U.S. Naval Academy at Annapolis, Maryland, or in the case of the Army, it's West Point is the commissioning pipeline for the Service Academy. Same for the Coast Guard Air Force Academy in Colorado Springs. You graduate from any of those, which are hybrid university/military academies, and you automatically are commissioned as a military officer. And then the third pipeline, which you're probably familiar with from civilian colleges, is ROTC, or Reserve Officer Training Corps. So you can go to a regular college, but you take military classes and you're part of a cadre there, and you learn military skills throughout your normal civilian college time. So each one of those pipelines has a certain number of billets dedicated to each of the warfare communities. So let's take the Naval Academy as probably the best case example. You go to Naval Academy, each class is approximately a graduating class of 1,000 people. Of those, 600 of those graduates will go on to become what they call surface warfare officers, SWOs. So there's 600 SEAL billets. Those are the guys who drive destroyers and aircraft carriers, and they operate on ships, and they're sort of like the classic, what we call blue water Navy, right? Maybe then 160 of the graduating class of that 1,000 will go on into aviation. So they'll either become, fighter pilots, NFOs, naval flight officers, the Goose to the Top Gun Maverick, right? Helicopter pilots, C-130 pilots, a whole host of something under the aviation umbrella. There's a bunch of subspecialty, so like intelligence officers and things like that. And then there's the Naval Special Warfare community, which is my community. And traditionally, there are very few of those billets. So they range somewhere between, for the Naval Academy, 10 and 20 billets per year for that graduating class at the Naval Academy. And what's important to remember, if we're breaking this down statistically, is that those billets just entitle you to get an opportunity to show up at training.
Right. Yeah.
Right. The attrition rate there is still quite high.
What's the attrition rate of BUD/S?
So it's related to this breakdown, and I hope this isn't too much in the weeds, but so the attrition rate for officers is less than it is for enlisted guys. So I don't actually know, but I think it's somewhere around 50% or 40% is the officer attrition rate. But the reason
less, that's still a lot, right? It's a lot of guys, right?
Yeah,
it's 1 in every 2 guys,
right? Well, so for the enlisted guys, they use kind of the big funnel approach, right? There's less sort of stringent. It's a less competitive to get a billet. So the overall attrition rate for guys who show up to SEAL training hovers around 85-90%. Right. Wow. So 85 or 90% of people who show up at SEAL training don't make it.
Wow.
Right. Now, for officers, they tend to do a little better as a community. And the reason is because there's so few billets, it's hyper competitive to get one of those billets. So here I am with all the other graduating seniors around the country in college competing for 10 billets to get it. So in terms of your physical performance, in terms of all of this stuff, to some degree, you're already pre-selected and pre-screened. That being said, still, a good 40 to 50% of those officers are quitting. In my particular class, and maybe this is the best way to summarize the numbers, we started with 246 guys, including 8 officers, and we graduated 26 originals, and 4 of those were officers. So we lost half the officers and about 90% of the class.
Wow. That's a bunch of guys.
Yeah.
Yeah. And we're going to talk about that in a second. But so going into it, you're training alongside the enlisted guys, right?
Absolutely.
So is there special treatment at all, or is it harder? I would assume it would be harder, right? They would kind of pressure you more since you're a leader.
SEAL training is unique in terms of warfare qualification school within the U.S. military because it's one of the only training programs where officers and enlisted go through side by side together. There's very little distinction in the training. There's zero distinction in the standards. Everybody has to meet the same standards. The only distinction is that, frankly, the officers are identified and they have extra leadership responsibilities in terms of being the liaisons for the class, in terms of being in charge of the administrative stuff. They say the best way to get through SEAL training is to be Mr. Gray. So the instructors don't even know your name until second phase. So they're not like singling you out for a beating or special treatment, right? It's absolutely impossible to do that as an officer. Because you have this big stripe on your head and you're already expected to be a leader. What's really interesting is that most of the instructors from SEAL training are enlisted SEALs themselves who are taking a rotational break from overseas from the deployment cycle. So many of those instructors who are some of the toughest and best SEALs to ever walk the planet, many of them consider themselves the gatekeepers of the community. And they know that they're only going to put through the best guys and the best officers, because it's very possible that you get out of training and you'll be their leader in the next SEAL platoon. So that's another unique facet of training. And this is symbolized even in our warfare designator, which is the trident, which signifies being a SEAL. The Naval Special Warfare Trident, traditionally warfare specialty insignias on enlisted guys' uniforms are silver and officers are gold. So for the surface warfare guys we were talking about earlier, an officer will have a gold warfare pin and the enlisted guy will have the silver equivalent. In the SEAL community, both officers and enlisted personnel wear the gold trident because we all go through the same training together.
Oh, interesting. Wow. So it even gets that deep.
Yeah,
wow.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
And then, so are you responsible during the training for? You mentioned some special things you have to kind of do that the enlisted guys don't have to do. Is it effectively more work that you're required to do, or?
It's certainly more work, and it's reflective of the kind of stuff that you're going to be responsible for. It's a microcosm of what you'll be responsible for when you graduate to the active duty SEAL teams. So you're going to have, some of the burden of mission planning, some of the burden of administration, some of the burden of leadership. And they want to imbue you with those kind of responsibilities early on because, frankly, they're pressure testing whether you can handle it, right? Like, to some degree, no. 100% BUD/S is just like a filtering mechanism to determine what kind of person you're going to be when you get into both the teams and in combat. And for officers, it becomes really important that you can handle those responsibilities on top of the normal SEAL responsibilities of jumping, diving, shooting, all of that stuff.
Got it. And then, so you mentioned that is a filtering mechanism. Is that the primary responsibility of the training, or is the training... Is it something else?
When you're in training, it feels like their primary responsibility is to kill you, right? But if you're really going to boil it down, like what BUD/S is trying to figure out is whether you're going to quit in combat. At its very essence, it's trying to determine what kind of character of person you are. When things get really, really hard, are you going to quit and you're going to ring that bell, or are you going to stay in it for your buddies and continue to do what's required of the mission? Maybe the best way to describe it is to talk about Hell Week, which is the hardest week, generally considered the hardest week of the hardest military training in the world. You don't sleep for a week. That first night of Hell Week, we probably ran like 30 miles with like boats and logs, and then it just gets worse from there. Vast majority of the class who quit during this portion of the time. One of the instructors prior to Hell Week, where there's a tremendous amount of anxiety, I remember him getting up and kind of explaining what Hell Week was to us before we started. And I'll never forget, because he had this really interesting metaphor that I had never heard before. He said, "You guys are a bunch of Grecian urns. And inside some of your urns is cotton, inside other urns is sand, inside some of your urns is steel. But inside a very few of you is this stuff called Damascus steel, which is the hardest steel known to man." And he's like, if you want to understand what Hell Week is, it's really simple. We're just going to smash your urns and figure out what's inside.
Okay, that's interesting.
Yeah, and that really is the purpose. When you graduate from BUD/S, Basic Underwater Demolition SEAL Training, which is the stuff that people see on the Discovery Channel and all that, when you graduate from BUD/S, you realize really quickly, like, hey, I can do a lot of push-ups, but I don't really know that much about being a SEAL. I know a little combat diving and stuff. So then you go on to advanced warfare qualification schools. So that's when you go to jump school. You spend 4 months at this training called SEAL qualification training. That's where you learn demolition, where you learn close quarters combat, where you learn parachuting, where you start to really pick up some of the skills that make the Naval Special Warfare community distinct from other communities.
Okay, this is interesting. So, you kind of mentioned that, leadership's a big aspect, and that's very difficult, right? What I find fascinating about the SEAL training is kind of that earn metaphor, right? It's the concept of like pressure testing people.
Exactly.
So a lot of people that listen to this podcast are, business leaders and the like. I'm always looking for ways to apply some of these concepts to business. Now, obviously, I think you can do it maybe less extreme or maybe not. I'd love to hear your thoughts on that. If there's a way to kind of apply this concept to other facets and other team styles.
I do. I think there is, and I think part of the deal is that. For me, one of the sort of horizontal transfer lessons over to the private sector is that people are pressure tested by adversity. So the true measure and performance of your team is not how they're doing when everything's going well, but it's how they deal with adversity. I think it's really a natural tendency for people to do evaluations when everything is sailing along and like you just closed a big round and the stock's up and like you're like the rev's looking good and all that stuff. But like how do you handle it when things go wrong? And one of the key factors that we're looking for when we're pressure testing people is and that's why we stress test them. And I don't think you need to stress test people to the same degree of extremity that we do in SEAL training. But I think when you stress test people, you see certain like innate characteristics of individuals emerge, like whether they become competitive versus vice collaborative, right? Whether they panic, right? We often say, especially, this might be a little bit of a loose analogy, but not that different than aviation. It's very rarely one single point of failure that causes an accident or causes something to go wrong. It's usually a causal chain sequence of events, right? And part of the thing that you need in any adverse environment, whether it's SEAL training, aviation, or in the private sector, is you need people to remain cool, calm, and collected throughout that like causal chain in order to make the best decisions.
So, would you recommend? Because like you said, it's really easy to assume things are great when things are going great,
right?
So, is it kind of a good idea then to throw some shit in the fan and see what to artificially create situations or different things like that to kind of make sure in the engineering community, for instance, there's this concept that was pioneered by Netflix called Chaos Monkey, right? And the idea is that for operations, for your different servers and all of these systems that you're running, and even to have really complex systems with thousands and thousands of servers, you want the system to always be running, and the constant state is it's broken. So really what they do is they design tools to break parts of the system on a regular basis so that it hardens you, so that to keep uptime, you have to build systems that can be resilient against that, So, what are your thoughts on something like that? Should people be thinking in terms of I guess artificially creating adversity or something like that to hard people?
I think 100%. At a very reductive level, we would say the more you sweat in peace, the less you bleed in war, right? You want those to build both sort of resilient network systems, but also resilient human systems. Because at the end of the day, you need both of those systems to have the capacity to deal with challenges, right? And so I would say yes, 100%, with the caveat that it's important to do it in a sort of thoughtful and deliberate way, right? Or you can't chaos in the chaos monkey, but like not just for the sake of chaos, right? Because you're testing specific resiliencies within systems. And I think there's a sort of a whole body of work related to resiliency in systems that's really fascinating and interesting. And we've done some of that in the special operations community as well.
That's great. So how are your teams structured? Is it around specialties? Is there a guy that does this and a guy that does that? How is that set up? Or is there redundancy on teams? Like, how do you?
There's certainly redundancy. Whether it's gear or people, we like to use the phrase, 2 is 1, 1 is none. But in general, the operating structure of a SEAL team is based on SEAL platoons, and SEAL platoons are 16-man elements. And this is slightly distinct from our brethren in the Special Forces community, the Army Green Berets, the Army Special Forces. Army Special Forces units tend to specialize a little bit. So there's an Army CQ, there's a Special Forces Green Beret, Special Forces CQC specialty team, or a Special Forces dive team. And that team specializes in diving. For SEALs, we're more generalists. We like to say that every SEAL shoots, every SEAL jumps, every SEAL dives. So we all have those kind of baseline requisite skills. And then within the platoon itself, people are given designations and specialize a little bit beyond that kind of baseline core set of competency and skills that everybody has. So there'll be and this is a little bit role oriented and a little bit training oriented. So there, for example, there is a medic or two in every SEAL platoon. That's what's called an 18 Delta. They're sent to the Army Special Operations Medic course, which is a very intensive course to teach you combat medicine. So one of those kind of personnel exists within every SEAL platoon. Then there'll be guys who have specialty roles. There'll be what we call the automatic weapons guys. So they'll carry the 60 or the SAW, which are heavier caliber, higher cyclic rate of fires, bigger machine guns, essentially. There'll be a sniper element within each platoon. These are guys who have gone off to specialty schools to learn specialty skills, specialty schools to learn specialty skills. So they've gone to sniper training and they'll carry, say, the sniper rifle. Those roles that I just outlined tend to be the enlisted roles. The officers tend to be more the leadership head shed, working in conjunction with probably the most critical element of a SEAL platoon, which is the senior enlisted. So the SEAL platoon chief. So this is a senior enlisted guy, usually an E7, which is a SEAL chief, a chief petty officer in the Navy, and he is kind of the tactical expert. And kind of, is the second in charge, the de facto second in charge of the SEAL platoon behind the officer leadership cadre.
Got it. Okay, cool. Now you also, I think you had a great metaphor with regard to the urns and those kind of things.
Yeah.
My question always when it comes to the BUD/S training, everything is something about the training. Does it activate something in somebody, or is it just something that has to be there, or is it something do you get something put there, or is it different for everybody? Like, what is that?
Yeah.
What is that like? What's your thoughts on that?
The sort of, it's like, it's a little bit of a variation on the nature nurture. Like, like what gets you through? Look, candidly, I don't have a good answer, and people have tried to figure it out. They don't want the kind of SEAL training that has a 90% attrition rate. They really don't. It's expensive to carry all those bodies through, right? In a perfect world, we would have an algorithm for pre-selecting and identifying the guys who are going to make it through training. It would be a hyper-efficient model. We'd get those guys the skills they need. In the real world, we haven't figured out how that's happened, and not for lack of trying. RAND studies commissioned on the kind of guys who make it through, all kinds of different pre-training programs. There's even private civilian sector pre-training programs run by ex-SEALs who, have turned this into a living, right? Preparing people to go to BUD/S, all this stuff. In general, we know that officers do better, but that's probably because of the selection methodology that we talked about earlier in the podcast. There are a few archetypes that tend to do better. Water polo players and wrestlers tend to do quite well at buds. I think that probably has something to do with the sort of adversity and this like intangible toughness thing that's kind of hard to measure. But like, look, the truth is there's guys that show up to buds who can barely swim and they make it. So
Wow.
they're just tough as shit.
So it's not like you're walking down the street, you see a guy and you're like, man, that guy can get through training.
Oh,
like,
no.
it's like,
You do that all the time, and it shows you exactly how poor intuition is, right? I mean, I still remember being in Hell Week and sitting next to what was called the LPO of the class, the leading petty officer. So this was a senior enlisted guy who had previously come from a community that was adjacent to the special operations community, and he was like a tough, ripped, good-looking guy, and I was like 100% convinced that this guy was going to make it. He was a stud by any metric and definition. He like walked, talked, acted the whole part, good physical scores, ran fast, lots of pull-ups, all that stuff. And I just remember sitting next to him on either the first or second night of Hell Week and just watching him. It's sometime around 3 a.m. in the morning when we were all jackhammering, shaking because we were getting hypothermic in the ocean, watching him just kind of stand up and just run for that bell.
just like, I'm out.
I was like, yeah, oh, I guess I was wrong about that one. So, look, SEALs come in all shapes and sizes. They come from all different demographic and athletic backgrounds. I personally believe that there is some innate internal quality, some not fifth gear, not sixth gear, some people who have an innate ability to tap into a seventh, eighth, and ninth gear that shouldn't even exist in theory, and not quit when things get incredibly arduous. That's my theory.
Got it. You know, I mean, the reason I ask is, and maybe this is an incorrect perception, correct me if it's incorrect. I consider SEALs extremely high-performing generalists, just based on kind of what I've read and stuff like that. And one of the things also that fascinates me about the training is, as an entrepreneur and somebody who builds teams, trying to construct teams that are like that, right? So I'm always looking for ways to identify good talent and those kind of things. I've even thought about building like funnel style processes to kind of, get people in and try to, work them until you find the build and earn creation or earn destroying machine,
right?
That kind of thing. But yeah, I mean, I'm curious to hear what your thoughts are on how some of this could be applied to, how you construct teams when it comes to business or anything else. I mean, any other projects you may be working on?
Yeah, for me, just being an officer in the SEAL teams was an incredible, being imbued with that much responsibility early on, both in terms of, basically taking young men into combat as a young man myself. Like there is no greater teacher than having that amount of responsibility thrust upon you when you're in your early 20s. So I do think there are these, I think there are valuable lessons that can be distilled from that. When I think in terms of composition of teams, I think one of the things from the SEAL teams is that we do, to some degree, there's no 100% perfect filter, but to some degree we do operate from that, in that Jim Collins good to great principle, right? That the quality of the team is going to be totally dependent as a baseline from the inputs that we get. And that's why the filtering system is so rigid. So we want to start with A caliber people. And it's true, you show up to a SEAL platoon and you have, 15 plus one, 16 thoroughbreds, right? And you got to get these guys all running in the same direction. They're also incredibly entrepreneurial, these guys. So you have to, and the leadership culture in the SEAL teams is incredibly flat and non-hierarchical compared to, say, a traditional military structure. The guys call you sir sometimes. often if they're using "sir," it's facetiously, right? they're sir in the sense like "fuck you, sir" is like what they mean, you know. No, you have to earn their respect, right? Respect is not given, and there's a variety of like sort of ways to earn their respect, but mostly at the end of the day, like the guys want to know that you're going to help them accomplish the mission one and then return home safely. I think the principle there is that because that leadership structure is incredibly flat, you have to create buy-in in terms of vision and mission. And I think the best SEAL platoons do that, and then the best entrepreneurs and private sector companies do that. They create a mission and a vision, and then this is the really challenging part. You have to sort of empower people to own that vision and go forth and execute. Like, you cannot micromanage a platoon of 16 pipe hitters. Like, they won't do it. They'll buck. Them thoroughbreds will buck, right? You gotta let them run, right?
Yeah.
And that's a challenge. I think one of the challenges that's unique to the SEAL community is that you have this real balance, right? You have these guys who are true warriors, true break glass in case of war kind of guys, and those are the people who we want deployed to faraway places defending our country and engaging in combat. At the same time, you have to teach them incredible measures of restraint, both in combat and then when they return back home, because those same skills that make you successful in a firefight could be the same things that get you in a tremendous amount of trouble when you're at home. Or we're asking guys to distinguish between non-combatants and civilians and combatants downrange. So you really want to empower people to make the best decisions, especially in the heat of the moment. Stan McChrystal wrote about this.
The Team of Teams book?
In the Team of Teams book, and he's talked about it a lot. But he helped pioneer this concept of the strategic private. What's so fascinating is that like these guys who are downrange, right? They can make one wrong decision that can have strategic and global consequences. They shoot one wrong person that can have incredible impact in terms of geopolitics, right? In terms of how the United States is perceived around the world. I don't think that's different than the way most companies operate these days. Like, information travels at such velocity that even like, and we've seen this in the private sector, like some very junior employee with access to critical information can make a left or right decision that could have strategic implications for the company and like massive second and third order effects. So how do you create a culture where the lowest ranking people in a company or a platoon are thinking with the same capacity and the same kind of horizon as the founders or the people at the top of the company? And to me, that's always the ultimate challenge.
So how do you do that?
Yeah.
That's the ultimate question. How do you?
Yeah. Well, look,
that's why you're here.
I don't know that I have that real truth on it. A couple principles. Mission first has always worked for me with the guys. As much as possible, complete and total transparency with them. I like to practice radical transparency because, frankly, most of these guys are smarter than me. They're going to figure it out anyways. Yeah. And you can never erode that sort of sense of trust that operates, especially within the small organic community of a SEAL platoon. And then ultimately, I think being willing to put yourself in harm's way in a SEAL platoon really means something. Right? In SEAL culture, right? You're never asking your guys to do something that you're not willing to do yourself. And I think there's parallels there to the private sector, right?
So not managing from the ivory tower, being on the front line, but down there in the trenches with folks and
absolutely, and kind of having your finger on the pulse, right, of what's going on, because it's at any level of leadership, like you're only as good as the inputs that you get, and if there's too much buffer between you and your customer, if there's too much buffer between you and the employees, and that information filter is skewed, you can't possibly, as a leader, execute the best decisions.
Have you ever read? There's a book about John Boyd. Have you read that book?
I have not.
Oh man, I'll send it. I'll just send you the book. But so Boyd was this guy. He was this fighter pilot in the Air Force, and they called him 42nd Boyd because he worked at the equivalent of Air Force's Top Gun, which was, I guess, more badass than the Navy Top Gun. Sorry.
Yeah.
And
right until they hit the golf course.
Yeah, right. And apparently his he had this way of looking at things, and there's a whole concept called the OODA loop that came out of this, which is observe, orient, decide, and act, which I think is now part of the business literature and pretty much everywhere. But that came from Boyd. And he did a really great job of helping people understand that you have to really be close so that you can observe and get faster cycles. And the thing he always talked about is the closer you are to the information, the faster you can cycle through the OODA loop, right? So you can act faster than your enemy. And then he did a great job of breaking this all down. I'm doing a horrible job articulating it, but I think anybody can. I'll send you the book, and anybody out there could read it as well.
No, I love it, and I really like the principle. Right, it allows you to be iterative faster, right, and that's like critical in any enterprise.
Yeah, cool. So the little more about the training, and then we'll kind of shut the lid on that one.
Yeah.
Did it change your perception on anything? Was there anything where you were going in, you thought, I can do 10 push-ups, and then you came out and realized you can do 50 million?
Yeah. I mean, it does. One of the things that SEAL training does is it teaches you like that you have infinite capacity beyond what you think you have. But it also taught me a tremendous amount about failure. So one of the things that was so startling and profound to me is we talked about Hell Week a little bit. If I were to ask you, like, when do you think most people quit in Hell Week? Most people would guess like, oh, is it when you're doing the obstacle course and you have to climb that 50-foot tower? Or is it when you're doing, the log PT with that huge heavy log, Old Misery everyone's talking about, which is miserable, right? Or is it, when you have to do a 2-mile ocean swim, at night or whatever? Like, no, it's none of those things, right? The number one time that most people quit is when it's either the first or second, not the first night, because there's like an adrenaline that carries you through. Everybody's excited. There's machine guns going off and breakout and all this stuff, and people kind of do it. It's the beginning of the second night at about 6 p.m. The instructors sit your whole class up on the berm overlooking the ocean, overlooking the Pacific Ocean, San Diego Bay, and right as dusk is coming, and they have you there, and they tell you to wave goodbye to the sun, and they get on these microphones, and Alpha Shift is coming. Alpha Shift is the night shift. It's gonna be a cold, long, dark night, right? And like, people are just running for that goddamn bell. And like, if you had told me prior to SEAL training that the most difficult part of the entire SEAL training pipeline was sitting on the beach at sunset, watching the sun go down, I would have been like, you're crazy. But it is. And what it teaches you is that the greatest impediment for most people is their own fear and their own mind. Because in general, once you push past that point, once you push past that fear of the unknown or the fear of what's happening next, most people generally finished. They're able to get themselves, and they're willing to do it. But your own fear can be your own worst enemy.
So are there any tricks to overcome that? Is it just stay moving, don't stop? Like, don't stop so you can think about it, just keep the adrenaline pumping the whole time, or?
Yeah, I think constant motion is part of it. But the other thing is, there are times that the end of the week, right? Because you don't sleep and, you're running a million miles and all that stuff. Like, it seems so far away, right? Like, you're never going to get there. And if you think about that, you'll never make it, right? Like, you're like, look, I can't even make it, back to the bathroom, right? Like, how am I gonna make it 300 more miles to Friday or whatever? So at those moments, like, you can only do what you can do. It's kind of like, how do you eat an elephant? Sometimes you're thinking like, let me just make it to lunch, because if I can get to lunch, I get to sit down. Right. And, but sometimes you're like, let me just put one more foot in front of the other, and then I can put one more foot in front of the other. So you keep moving, but you kind of have to sometimes kind of refocus for these long tasks into like, what is accomplishable in this exact moment. And that was really valuable for me, to not always project, in this case, a week, or in any other case, a million miles down the road, but to actually just nail the step that's right in front of you.
How often do you use that?
Quite a bit.
Yeah.
Quite a bit. I mean, I think especially as you transition over to the private sector and you're trying to achieve any long-term goals in your life, you have to create a series of micro goals that will help get you there.
Cool. Okay, cool. So that's training. I'm going to cross that off. I can talk for hours about that.
We're all trained. Like,
yeah, ready to go.
It's time to celebrate.
I want to talk about waterboarding.
Yeah, let's get it. That lovely non-controversial subject. Yeah.
Yeah, no, because you paid some guys to waterboard you on Current TV.
I did,
and I watched it. It's kind of crazy. As somebody watching it is crazy. So what was it like experiencing that?
Yeah. Well, you thought we had closed the door on SEAL training, but not quite, because the truth is, the first time that I was waterboarded in SEAL training.
Oh, wow.
They send you to a school that's called SERE, Survival, Evasion, Resistance, Escape.
Yeah.
And it's a school for anybody who might end up captured overseas. And they teach you techniques to resist interrogation. First, to resist capture, and then second, if you do get captured, to resist interrogation. And I was waterboarded during my SEAL training. And so that's how it was on my radar. And then in 2006, I was the first person, after I had got off active duty, I was the first person to have myself waterboarded on national TV. And that was as I was transitioning into a media correspondent role. And that was kind of the first thing that I did in the public sphere after being in this, very secret community for a long time. That kind of went big as like part of the national conversation. And it gave me kind of an idea of the potency of this new profession that I was entering.
How'd you decide on to go into correspondent, the kind of, I want to call it edgy correspondent, because you're not on just CNN kind of hanging out. You're in the thick of it, getting waterboarded. And,
right.
And I mean, there was like a Vice episode where you met some hitmen in Puerto Rico or something.
Yeah. Those guys were great. We chatted guns. We had a lot to bond over. We went out into the jungle and shot off some machine guns. Well, I think part of this was my background, is that I gravitated towards stuff that I was familiar and comfortable with. So I was in graduate school at the time when I started doing correspondent work to offset the cost of graduate school. I had friends in media, and they said, look, we think you'd be great at this. And I was kind of, I had been at the pointy end of the spear for a long time. I had been the man in the arena, doing stuff overseas. But I was also interested in this component of the people who were making those bigger decisions that would send a team like mine downrange. What were the policies behind that? What were the politics behind it? And so that's when I went to sort of graduate school to get a more 50,000 foot perspective on that. And it's also when I started doing media work. And it was cool. What I found was, my first year in graduate school, that Christmas, I was in Afghanistan doing correspondent work. I did spring break Cambodia, summer in Somalia, all the good vacation spots.
Yeah.
But what I found, it was cool. It gave me a good more of a peer-to-peer relationship with my professors at Harvard. Many of them were writing about these places and writing about, the geopolitics of these places, but I was actually boots on the ground in those places, both in uniform and then now as a journalist, and it allowed me to kind of engage with my professors in a very different way. So so that's kind of what drove me into media.
That's actually really interesting. There's a ton there. So you were doing some work for Vice for a little while.
Yeah. So originally, as you mentioned with the waterboarding thing, I was at Current TV, and I'll tell you that story in 30 seconds because it's cool. But so I've worked at a bunch of different outlets from Current TV. I then left to go to CNN as a correspondent there, both for CNN International and CNN Domestic, trying to bring more of that kind of like what I call intrepid, action-oriented journalism to the mainstream outlets. I found a home at Vice, and I was one of the correspondents for the Friday night show on HBO, Vice on HBO. I was able to do some really good stuff there, and I continue to work in that space. I have a new series for one of the OTT platforms that I'm doing. That's all in that same spirit. But if I was going to encapsulate, what I do, like there's no like pure term for it because I've always been a little uncomfortable with the idea of like just pure journalism. I think there's a lot of problems with that. I consider myself more in the kind of George Plimpton category of action journalist or immersive journalist, where I like actually go to these places, I touch the soil, I get engaged in what's going on, and it allows me, and my military background kind of sometimes allows me access to worlds that I wouldn't get traditionally as a journalist.
What do you think that is? Is it just your willingness to take risk, or what's the...
Part of it is a risk calculus, but part of it is also like other people's willingness to take risk. So we're often, as journalists, like limited by the access that we can curate. So one example, I'll give you two examples. Very obvious example, I was the only journalist or the first journalist to be embedded on the front lines in the fight against Boko Haram in Nigeria. The Nigerian government had actually banned journalists from entering the country. When I was there, 2 Al Jazeera journalists tried and they got arrested. And they spent a couple months or a couple weeks in Nigerian jail, which is not a hotel I would recommend. That Gray Bar Hilton is like a 1-star rating. You don't want that one. I was able to get into that group because there was a group of mercenaries, private military contractors who had been secretly hired in the fight against Boko Haram. I knew them from the old days, and they allowed me to join their group.
That's actually something interesting I had written down to ask how because Vice does a phenomenal job of getting access to some people that you normally wouldn't be able to get access to. And what I love about Vice is how it's also accessible to kind of a younger demographic, right? It's not kind of stuffy news. It's gritty, the guy's wearing just regular clothes, and it's got a different kind of, it's not Anderson Cooper, right? It's kind of a more edgy kind of thing. So how do you guys go about, you mentioned some old guys you knew that were mercenaries and that kind of thing. How do you go about, getting people to trust you that normally wouldn't trust people otherwise?
Yeah, at the end of the day, it's some of its background, especially like with law enforcement agencies. I was the only guy to this day who's been embedded on a certain type of DEA operation overseas, right? And I'm firmly convinced that those guys allowed me to do that because of my military background, and they were comfortable that I came from the same like sort of culture that they came from, and I had kind of brokered those relationships. I do think it's rapport building, whether that's on the institutional side, like you have to go kiss the ring of the ambassador, convince him that you're doing a certain kind of story, and like it's sort of at least semi-aligned with like what their goals are, or whether that's on the criminal side and you're trying to get a guy who cooks cocaine to show you the process. You have to figure out what people's incentives are, figure out what their third rails are, right? Figure out what's dangerous to them, and then sort of navigate in between those two to convince them that you're not going to put them in jeopardy, and that two, you're going to tell like a fair, straight, honest story. But at the end of the day, it's like building trust.
It sounds a lot like what you said before about leading, the SEAL teams, right?
Yeah.
Building consensus and,
Yep.
that kind of thing. Sounds very, very similar.
Yeah, well, I'm like a one-trick pony, right?
Just give you the same thing.
I mean, look, my particular style was, forged at 23 years old when I graduated SEAL training, and I became the officer in charge of a naval special warfare unit, and I had 8 guys and millions of dollars of equipment underneath my purview, and I had to lead those guys into harm's way and bring everybody back home safe. So I do think in life it's important to have a kind of like solid cadre of experience like that informs a lot of your decision makings. Simultaneously, and I rely, as you can hear, I lean on those kind of maxims of humans, not hardware, of you can't mass produce special forces. I take those maxims into the civilian world all the time. At the same time, it's really important to be able to sort of evolve and to continue to grow and to be a lifelong learner, because I see a lot of guys who are extraordinarily successful in the military have a really difficult time making that transition to the private sector, because there's a lot of crossover, and a lot of the character traits that make you successful in the military have value in the civilian world, but they are what economists call necessary but not sufficient. You need another skill set evolved on top of that really solid bedrock foundation that you built in the military in order to be able to succeed and thrive in the civilian sector.
So is that training that we can give some vets coming back? I mean, so I'll just give you a little background on this. So my brother served, he was in the Army for, let's say 4 years, 5 years, something like that. I probably should know that. He's actually up in Santa Cruz now, at UC Santa Cruz. Yeah.
Awesome.
Yeah.
A banana slug.
Yeah.
That's awesome.
So and I know he's had some issues just readjusting, just kind of, and it's not, it's not the things that I think people think, it's the camaraderie he had with the guys that he deployed with. He has issues finding something even remotely similar to that here, right? And like you said, some of the skill sets and the different things you see and hear, and how in one area that's a survival mechanism that makes you thrive, and in one area kind of, it can necessarily sometimes maybe hurt you. So is there like a training or something? Like what can we do to kind of help people make that transition?
Well, there's no single solution set, but I think in your description of your brother, there's actually a lot of profundity there. And I think you honed in on some really key concepts, and I'll just sort of react to that stream of consciousness style. One of the things that I heard you saying is, and I think this is really astute, people make the mistake all the time of thinking that you go to war for your country or for a paycheck or something like that. It's total bullshit, right? You go to war for the guy to the left and the guy to the right of you. Like, absolutely. There's a sort of, semi-conscious, subconscious. There's all, there's this constellation of reasons that you do anything, but primarily, like, what gets you to go into an extraordinarily dangerous situation is because you don't want to let down the guys who are with you, and because you love them and you care deeply about them. And that is really difficult to replicate in the civilian world. And part of the reason is, thank God, there's very few things in the civilian world that replicate that level of intensity or adrenaline or peril, right? And so those create automatic bonding experiences that are hard to emulate. That being said, I do think there are substitutions, and there are ways to think about veterans transition, even acknowledging some of these challenges. One of the things that I think about when I think about veterans transition is mission and purpose. So there's countless examples of guys, they come back, they get a job, right? They were just overseas, arguably doing something really honorable and really important, or certainly important in terms of the kinds of responsibilities they had, whether that was driving supervising a convoy in Iraq so that supplies could make it from base to base, right? That is an amazingly responsible job. And now you're like, a product manager at Coca-Cola slinging sugar, and it doesn't have that same sense of meaning and purpose. So I think for all veterans coming back in the military, you have a very specific mission and purpose of service. I think you have to ask yourself, how am I going to continue to be of service when I come back home and take the uniform off? And veterans who answer that question well tend to be the most successful in their civilian career. At a very pragmatic level, what your brother's doing is actually one of the keys. For me, I feel like I had a very successful transition from active duty to the civilian sector because I went to graduate school. One of the things that veterans in general are missing, one of the challenges for them, is that the military tends to be incredibly isolating. You're off on these bases, you're deployed overseas, and you don't actually develop all of the social networks that, say, your peers who, go and work in Mountain View, and they're surrounded by like a million other, entrepreneurs and guys in their same community. And those guys then like hang out at a bar and decide to start a company, and then it becomes a unicorn together, right? You're missing that when you leave the fold of the military community. There's graduate school or undergraduate, going back to school, which the GI Bill often facilitates, is probably one of the best things you can do because it amplifies your social networks. All of a sudden you have like this whole, we're all a product of our influences. Now you have like this whole community of people with different ideas and different skills and different experiences that you can call on. Candidly, in my civilian job as a conflict zone correspondent, as a war correspondent around the world, I just as much call on my relationships from graduate school, because those guys are working in the embassy in Pakistan or defense ministers of Nicaragua, as I do on my contacts from the military community. So I do think in terms of soft landing, school is an amazing way for veterans to do it. If school is not an option, or you're taking a different path, I think you still have to ask yourself that fundamental question, like, what am I going to do of meaning, right? And understand that like your country still needs you and your service still matters. So whether that means that you're going to be a Little League coach, whether it means you're going to teach in schools, whether it means you're going to join the Boys and Girls Club and mentor young people, like all of those things I think are critical to successful transitions and changing this kind of narrative that we have of like a PTSD-laden veteran returning home and struggling to acclimate back to society.
Cool. So, so this is another section that's kind of a new section actually of the podcast called Perception versus Reality.
Ooh.
So how it works is I give you perception,
yes,
and you give me the reality.
Okay.
Right? So perception, U.S. Navy SEAL. After BUD/S, you're a total badass. You go into the teams and operate at a tempo that's just absolutely insane without any additional work.
Certainly more on the perception side. Guys who graduate from SEAL training are super hard, but they are in no means ready, set, go to deploy overseas. You then have to take all of those skills and you have to integrate them into a group of other guys with similar skills and know each other so intimately that you can parachute out of an airplane in the middle of the night on night vision goggles, land, navigate towards a target, go into a house, and know by a guy's shape in the dark whether he's going to go left or right and what kind of move he's going to make. And you have to do this coordinated combat dance. And then after the mission is over, you have to safely extract. That takes years and years of training, and it takes years of synchronization with your fellow SEALs to do it really, really well.
Got it. So you're just a beginner. You come out, you're just
in the old days, they didn't even give you your trident when you graduated from SEAL training. You had to go to a team and they put it in a glass case and they held it for you for 6 months while you got trashed as an FNG, flippin' new guy in child-friendly language for 6 months. And then when they thought you were decent enough to integrate into
Wow.
the platoon you got to wear.
That's hilarious. So you don't even, that's great. Wow. So at graduation, you don't get anything? Is it?
So that
or
was-
they give it to you and then you just give it to the guys at the.
That's how it was. They held it, and then there was a pinning ceremony. Now you're actually awarded your pin, your trident. You become officially a Navy SEAL after not the basic underwater demolition SEAL training, which everybody knows about, but the advanced warfare qualification. So after you go to sniper school and jump school and advanced warfare training and winter warfare training up in Kodiak, Alaska, and desert warfare training out in Nyland. So after an additional 6 to 7 months of training, you're then awarded your Naval Special Warfare Trident, but you're still considered an FNG when you got it, and they can take that thing away really quickly.
Wow. Okay. Cool. Yeah. All right. So next, perception versus reality. Reporter. A peddler of fake news intent on telling the side of a story that's there to push some kind of influence or angle.
For me, no. No. I think this is one of the most complicated but important social cultural questions that we could have today, and you see it being battled every day in the headlines, right? You have the administration like pushing this idea of fake news. You have like the media pushing back against it. The reality is that it's complicated, right? There is a tremendous amount of misinformation and disinformation out there in the media space. At the end of the day, reporters are people. They bring agendas, they bring biases. The best thing they can do is be really transparent about that and practice a good set of skills to do that. That is very rarely done. And it's not just a problem of dissemination of information, it's a problem of absorption of information. I think increasingly it's becoming harder and harder to have the analytical skills to discern truth from agenda. And so I do think in some paradoxical way, we are entering like a dangerous post-truth era where we're not all dealing with the same set of facts, information, analytical tools. And it makes it really hard to build mass consensus and to build things and do things and make decisions on things. Because again, to harken back to our earlier conversation, we're only as good as our inputs. And the inputs aren't that great right now.
So what do you think the answer to that is? Is it just training people on, I guess, or giving people a general sense of skepticism, or like what's the answer there? And that's a whole 30-minute conversation.
It's a whole 30-minute conversation, but I'll highlight or underscore two components of it that I think are really important. And I can recognize the problem, but I don't necessarily know the fix, right?
Yeah, me neither. That's why I'm asking you. Yeah.
One of the problems is the incentive systems within media themselves are totally fucked. They're totally misaligned, right? We're incentivized in this ad-based clicked model, not for truth and information, but for salaciousness and clicks. So the more outlandish a headline you write, the more outlandish an article you write, the more popular an article you write, that's how the revenue is generated for your distribution outlet. And as long as we have a system that incentivizes salaciousness over truth, or incentivizes, popularity over importance, all of these things, that's a massive challenge. So we have to, at some very macro level, think about how the entire media ecosystem is incentivized, because it's pretty problematic, especially with digital, right? So that's on one side. And then the other component, which I sort of alluded to earlier, is the education component. It's no longer a problem of finding information. Google has solved that problem for finding it. Now the problem is having the analytical skill set to, one, sort of discern, truth from fallacy, or even sort of less binary than that, having the analytical tools to take a bunch of components of disparate information or disparate ideas and synthesize them into something meaningful that we can do with. I you have little kids, so you may know more than me, but my intuition says it's going to be hard to arm this next generation who have all the information in the world at their fingertips, but not necessarily all of the knowledge of what to do with that information.
Yeah, I struggle with trying to figure this out as well. How I'm going to direct my kids to having that critical thinking, because that's really what it is. The information's available. Some of it's true, some of it's not. How do you approximate truth based on a bunch of data that may be false or may be true and may look like it's true because it's coming from a certain source? It's very difficult. I don't have a solution for that yet, but it's an ongoing work in progress for me. So
totally. God, I thought this was going to be more rapid fire, but these
okay. So now we're in quick fire for sure. Quick fire. You mentioned we've talked about education a couple times. Any favorite books?
Oh, wow. I probably should have thought about this, but I did. Yes, I mean, probably the most important book that I've ever been given was an anthology that my father gave me, which was it was an Esquire anthology of essays called How to Be a Man. Like, it was basically a collection of essays about manhood that really, like, going back 50 years, right? There's been some extraordinary writing. And so that was, I feel like, a very seminal influence in my life. Tom Wolfe's The Right Stuff, when I was a young 14-year-old aspiring private pilot with 40 hours in a Cessna, really was fundamental in my life. And then later in my life, I read Samantha Power's book, which is called A Problem from Hell, America in the Age of Genocide. It was her PhD thesis at Harvard. She went on to win a Pulitzer Prize for it. And it was chronicled America's responses to 5 different genocide. Samantha Power went on to become the ambassador to the UN. She was my professor at Harvard, and she was kind of instrumental in this kind of phase of my life that where I was transitioning from being just an operator to somebody who thought about sort of the bigger implications of those decisions on the front lines. And then I guess since you have little kids, I don't know if it's worth it or not. I'll tell you my 2 favorite childhood books, more as an ominous warning. Yeah. So my mom used to read me religiously. She could probably still recite it by memory. This book called Sammy the Seal, about this kind of intrepid but slightly rambunctious seal that went around, escaped from the circus and, with balance balls on his nose and all that stuff. And then I used to read the Tintin series, which were about this journalist, this little French journalist, and his dog, and his little dog Snowy, that he traveled around the world with in wild places. And then, of course, I grew up to be both a SEAL and a journalist. So it's a life lesson in be careful what you read to your kids.
Okay, cool. What do you wish you knew now, or what do you know now that you wish you knew 10 years ago?
I wish, in terms of, for a decade, this is very specific to me in media, but for a decade, I was content to just be in media, to go overseas and do the most important stories in the world. And I was less cognizant of the business side of the house. And both in terms of operating at the highest level of producing content, I think it's really important to understand the business dynamics that drive the creative and the content decisions, and to understand television for what it is, which is a marketing platform sometimes. So I wish I had been more savvy earlier in my career about building those things, but I was so happy just running and gunning, for whatever outlet would send me downrange to the most dangerous place, that I don't think I necessarily put it together, this incredible gold mine that I was sitting on. Had I done that a decade ago when I started in media, I might have built a different set of businesses around it, which is good both for money, but it's also good in terms of the kind of impact you can create in the world.
Okay. 2 more. Productivity tool or technique that you use every day. Do you have one?
Yeah. I have two. I get up early and I crank out work. My focus is greatest.
Yeah, I think you sent me an email like 6 a.m.,
Always.
5 a.m. this morning.
Yeah, that's my normal.
Okay.
Yeah, and I think I'd been up working for a while. So I like to get up and write and do creative work, especially in the morning. And then the other component for productivity for me is an alignment of mind and body. So right after I wrote you an email, I think I went with our mutual friend Justin for a run, swim, run. Right. So I took him on a run, swim, run. I try and do that every morning, or I own the CrossFit gym. I'll go to yoga right after this podcast studio. I do think that you want to keep your physical side up because one, it gives you more stamina, it gives you more horsepower just for life, and so that's really a productivity key for me. It's also key for changing your thinking sometimes. So there's this apocryphal story about Obama, taking an outside meeting and walking around the Rose Garden and being convinced to change his policy on Syria, right? Because sometimes just changing your surrounding or being physically active creates a different neurochemistry, has different endorphins flowing that allows you to be more open-minded to orthogonal ideas.
Okay, and then the last one here is, what advice would you give people who want to be, I guess, a journalist / Navy SEAL?
Oh yeah. I think I think there's this variation on a theme, which is like, in your 20s you learn, in your 30s you earn. My construction of life, people ask me that question like very seriously. I know you're kind of tongue in cheek about it, but like people like really want to know, like, I want your job. I want to be a war correspondent. I want to go overseas and be on TV, and have a lot of Instagram followers. I want to do that whole thing. How do I do that? How do I become a reporter at Vice? And I was like, well, first you got to go to SEAL training, then you got to not quit, then you got to go to Harvard and get a master's. Yeah.
It's so easy. I could do it in the weekend.
Right.
It's kind of
there's no straight line to these goals.
Yeah.
And just like SEAL training, everybody has to find their own individual path. There, my route was incredibly circuitous. I went to the Naval Academy, and then I went to a civilian college, and then I went to officer candidate school, sort of an a-traditional path, even within an a-traditional community. But what I did have was this thing that we talked about up on the top of the berm there, is like, keep moving. And you have to have that one kind of seminal anchor experience in your 20s, right? If you're a finance guy that's like grinding it out as a banker, 120 hours a week at Goldman as an analyst or whatever, you got to have that one kind of foundational experience that's going to help you understand the world. And then you have to have a bunch of other experiences that you can like add onto it. So do something bold, do something big, join the Peace Corps, like join the service, like put in your time in your 20s. And then this crazy thing happens in your 30s, is that diverse set of experiences kind of coagulates together into a more defined mission, right?
Yeah, it's completely true. It's really weird. Yeah. Cool. Sorry, I didn't cut you off.
No, that was it. That was
just agreeing.
That was the whole point. Yeah.
Cool. Okay, cool. So we'll just leave it there. Thanks so much for the time. This was great.
Awesome, man. Super fun.
Cool.